Hi watercolorists. Today I'm going to show you some different kinds of washes with watercolor or ways to apply the paint. And it's pretty basic. So if you've been painting a while, you probably already know about this, but it's just good to go over it. I have wet my paints in my palette with my spray bottle, so they're nice and moist. And I think I'm going to use the same color for all three, well, not for the wet and wet, but for the flat wash and the graded wash, I'm going to use the same color. So I'm going to dip into Scarlet Lake, which is a nice bright springtime orange color. And it is a color by Winsor Newton. So I'm putting a nice rich bit of it on my palette. Now I'm going to use a 1-inch flat brush for this application, and on this first one I'm going to work on dry paper, although you could do it on pre-wet paper also, but this is just going to create a very flat surface like painting a wall, and you want to try and get it so there's no streaks when you're done. So just a nice flat area of color. So here I go. Have your brush nice and loaded with paint, and I'm kind of overlapping each stroke. It looks like it's coming out nice and flat. You have to be careful if it's a really dry day and you're waiting a long time in between strokes, you might get a like a stripe between your colors. So if you're working on a complicated area that isn't just a nice rectangle, you have to be careful to work quickly. And it doesn't hurt to go back over it in the opposite direction, just to make sure it's nice and flat. And then I'm going to take a tissue. I've taped off my paper with masking tape, but I'm just going to clean the edges off. If this area starts to dry and there's a little dab of liquid paint on the side and it grabs hold of it, you'll get this little background on the side or a little blossom, which in this case you wouldn't want. So that looks nice and flat. I think I achieved the result that I wanted. So if you haven't tried this in a while, you know, it might be a good little practice for you to do, because we're going to be using the washes in some of the projects that we're doing. Okay, the next one is not going to create a flat look, but it's going to fill this rectangle. But here's where you can mix different colors and get a sort of a spontaneous mixture. So on this one, maybe I'll add a more cool red permanent rose here, which is more like a magenta. And I'll use the New Gamboge, which is a nice yellow. So on this one, I'm going to take clean water and I'm going to pre-wet my area. And as I said before, you could do a flat wash on wet paper also, but to compensate for the water that's already on the paper, you'd have to mix a nice rich mixture of pigment, so you don't end up with too lighter of a value. So I could end up with the same look here as I do on wet paper, but I'd have to really punch up the amount of pigment I have on my brush. Okay, so on this, I'm gonna go in and put some strokes of yellow, sort of random. And then if I mix reds with it, I'll get sort of an orange. Be careful that doesn't go into that. So maybe I'll put a little of that Scarlet Lake in there also. So it's softening. And get a real soft mixture. The wetter it is, the wetter the paper is when you apply the color, the more it'll burst into mixtures of color. One thing you can do if you really want to assure that it's nice and wet is to wet the paper first, let it soak in a minute, and then wet it again. So that's a wet into wet wash. Now at this point, this is sort of half dry. I suspect that if I dropped a little bit of water in this, I would get a little blossom or a background. And that was what I was trying to avoid. And you can see that sort of blossoming a little bit with wiping off the edges so I didn't have that happen accidentally. But that's kind of what that will look like. If the paper's real wet, you won't get that happening so much. It only happens when it's half dry or the magic moment. Okay, this last one I think is the most difficult. It wouldn't hurt for everybody to practice this one more time if you haven't done it in a while. And this is a graded wash or graduated wash. And here's an example of it right here. These are both flat washes. And what you want to do is go from dark to light gradually where you don't see a little division at any one point. So let's try the Scarlet Lake again. And this time we're gonna work on dry paper for sure. I want to have enough pigment here to start with. So my brush is going to be loaded with paint. And I want to definitely work on dry paper. So once I dip in this section of orange, I'm not going to dip back in that again. I'm just going to be dipping in water from here on out. So I'm going to put my first stroke. Then I'm going to dip a little corner of the brush into water and dab it on my sponge and overlap maybe a third of the way. So I'm now introducing a little bit of water, which, as we know, with watercolor makes it lighter, so more transparent, so more of the paper colors, the white of the paper is showing through. So I'm dipping in again, dabbing it on the sponge, and overlapping again. Dipping it in, dabbing it on the sponge, so I don't get too much water introduced at once. And so I should be seeing it getting slightly lighter, and then as it dries too, it's going to get lighter. So again, dipping in. Now I'm dipping the whole thing in, dabbing on the sponge, overlapping. Can you see it getting lighter? Dipping, dabbing, until you're almost just working with a little bit of dirty water that's left in your brush. So I got almost all of the paint out of it. And I'm just going to go ahead and continue down to the bottom till I almost get the white of the paper. So that's a graded wash. Now to smooth it out even more, one little trick is to go back up again. So I start at the bottom and then just kind of smooth it out as I go back up. Although that was a pretty nice graded wash, I thought I did. And then go back down again. So it's distributing the paint a little more evenly. I can see a few little stripes, but as it starts to dry, that will smooth out. So what you want to try and do is make sure you don't have any sudden change from dark to lighter, and it's just a gradual transition. Okay, those are 3 different washes. Give it a try.